Poetry. It's strange to think how many fragments of poetry have entered, and some of them remained in my mind over the years. I can recite little bits as I walk around or as I'm thinking or going to sleep. For example, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Or 'twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy where the moor grows, and the moan wraths outgrabe. Or, know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Or, she dwelt unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. But she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. And many, many more. I probably can have been influenced and know more poetry than many of my friends. And when I consider why this should be the case, I can see a whole lot of accidents through my lives which have made me gravitate towards poetry. One of them is my family. From my birth, I grew up in a very poetic English family. My grandmother was a great declaimer of things, actress and so on, and she enjoyed and loved poetry, and so she would recite bits of poetry to me, and we lived together in many ways for my first 20 years or more, because she looked after me when my parents were away. And particularly my grandfather, who, although he was a soldier, he'd always loved poetry, and he should really have been an academic or something like that. And he carried books of poetry around even in the trenches when he got his military cross and so on. And he would recite bits of poetry, and later on when we wrote letters to each other, he would enclose his favourite poetry in it. Even more so, my mother. My mother adored poetry. I've edited her works, and I can see that her love of poetry goes back to very early on. She was writing quite good poetry when she was about 15 years onwards, which I've included in the first volume of her biography. And later on, she would write snatches of poetry, which I've put together in a book on love and love's legacy by Macfarlane. She has poetry about her family, about the Hebrides, about India, and some of it really very good indeed. And bits of that still stick in my mind about her legacy to her grandchildren and so on. And so the family wrapped me round with poetry. And then the next accident was going to a particular boarding school at Oxford, the Dragon School in North Oxford, because that was a school where poetry was placed very high in the curriculum and in daily life. It's the only school I know of which had its own book of selected poetry, the Dragon Book of Verse, which had been first written in the 1930s and then was constantly republished. And I went on using, even at the following school, the Dragon Book of Verse was there. And my first introduction to a number of poems is there with the illustrations. I can still see the illustration beside the section on Shakespeare. And many of my favourite poems I first learnt between the age of 9 and 12 at the Dragon, where we had poetry prizes and we recited every week. We had to practice a poem and recite it. And so that went on, and also in things like Gilbert and Sullivan operas, there was quite a bit of amusing poetry. When I went on to the next boarding school at Sedbergh, poetry was also extremely important there, and I gravitated towards the art side, and in the end ended up, my best subject was in fact English. And we did a number of poets. Shakespeare, obviously, several of his plays, but also Shelley and Gerard Manley Hopkins. And in intervals, I read a lot of Keats and particularly the Romantic poets who I loved. The other accident was at the same time we went to live in the Lake District in Esthwaite-Dale, and there I discovered that William Wordsworth, the great Romantic poet, had gone to school in the local village, Hawkshead, and a lot of his most beautiful autobiographical poem, The Prelude, was set in the mountains and valleys round where I was living. So I would walk around reading bits of poetry from Wordsworth and others. I followed Wordsworth round the continent to see how he had been influenced by his travels when he was a young man. And so poetry and Wordsworth and my home and schools became enveloped together. And then when I went to Oxford felt a very poetic place, and I had girlfriends who loved poetry too, and so the letters which I've published in the book on Oxford undergraduate have lots of scraps of poetry which we sent to each other. Often you couldn't say in words what you felt about the other person, so you would put it into the verse, and you learnt a lot about the other person from the poetry they chose. Then when I went to Nepal as an anthropologist, I took some poetry and used to go up and relax on the mountain reading the poetry. And when I came back to Cambridge, the poetic tradition continued. Later, when I came to write about Cambridge, I discovered it was the most poetic university in the world. About 2/3 of the great English poets went to Cambridge. And in retirement, I've continued with this. So poetry has infused my life. And finally, when I was at King's, I was asked to help with the installation of a stone to the greatest 20th century, most famous 20th century Chinese poet, Zhu Zhimo. So I did that, and I got involved in organizing events with Chinese poets and others, and learnt that the English are not the greatest or the only great poetic tradition, as I had thought, but that also the Chinese, even more so. Their language seems very appropriate for poets, and in the period which in England was the Anglo-Saxon period, but in China the Tang, there are thousands of remembered great poets of that period, and no occasion like a dinner or feast or whatever is complete without people who are eating, getting up and reciting some poetry. Poetry is obviously exceedingly powerful because it combines different ways of telling the truth. The mixture of the story and the rhyme and the rhythm makes it more powerful in many ways than prose. It shocks you into a new awareness of nature or love or whatever the thing it's describing. And so it is, like all art, it simplifies life, makes it more direct, more powerful, and it enters into you in a way which a piece of written prose doesn't do. So probably of the arts, poetry affects me more even than music, perhaps, and every Sunday I try and sit in our Japanese tea house and read a little bit of selected poetry, and every day I read a poem, something I started to do at university. Often T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, which I read through about 6 or 7 times, which I really love. Or at the moment I'm reading Victorian poetry and discovering poets I'd hardly heard about, and really wrote delightful poetry. So Know Then Thyself ends with wonderful words on created half to rise and half to fall, great judge of truth in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. Thank you.